January 26, 1945. Holzwihr, France. Snow covered the ruined village, smoke drifted over the shattered roofs, and the air smelled of oil, metal, and burning flesh. A young German soldier from the 2nd Mountain Division pressed his face to the shattered window of a field aid station. Through the drifting smoke, he could see his comrades being carried in on stretchers, men who, only an hour earlier, had marched out with confidence and cold discipline. Now they came back twisted, screaming, or silent. 250 men, 6 tanks, and one clear objective: to overrun an American position held by a single lieutenant standing beside a burning M10 tank destroyer. That lieutenant was Audie Murphy. He was barely 20 years old. Wounded, covered in dirt and blood, he climbed onto the flaming wreck and grabbed hold of the heavy machine gun mounted on top. For the next hour, the battle became a nightmare. The German attack dissolved under a storm of gunfire. The weapon Murphy held, the Browning M2 .50 caliber heavy machine gun, was not a miracle of modern technology or some secret Allied project. It was an old design, dating back to 1933. A simple, brutally efficient product of American industry. By the time the smoke cleared, only 70 of the attacking Germans could still fight. The rest lay scattered across the frozen ground, silent testimony to a single gunner's defiance. The survivors spoke not of courage or tactics that night, but of the weapon. They called it the Hammer of God, a gun whose bullets did not merely wound, they erased. German medical officers soon learned to recognize the wounds it inflicted: limbs torn apart, torsos pulverized, faces unrecognizable. Unlike rifle bullets that might pierce cleanly, the .50 caliber slug transferred such tremendous kinetic energy that the human body could not contain it. In field hospitals, orderlies whispered grimly when they saw such injuries. There was little they could do. A shot to the arm meant amputation. A shot to the chest meant death. The German soldiers learned to dread not only the weapon itself, but the sound of it, the deep, percussive rhythm that rolled across the battlefield like thunder. Even those who escaped physical harm often did not escape the psychological toll. Medical reports began recording combat exhaustion and nervous collapse at rates far higher among troops exposed to sustained .50 caliber fire. The effect was invisible but devastating. Soldiers could no longer trust cover. They believed that no wall, no tree, no stone was thick enough. Under .50 fire, survival seemed a matter of luck, not skill. And when luck becomes the only hope, discipline begins to crack. Holzwihr was not the only battlefield where the M2 carved its legend, but it was the moment when fear began to take shape. A fear that would follow the German army from the hedgerows of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes, from the sands of North Africa to the crumbling cities of the Reich. To the Germans it seemed incomprehensible. The Americans had not built the most advanced machine gun. The Browning M2 fired slowly compared to their own MG-42. It weighed more, and its ammunition was cumbersome. But it almost never failed. It could fire in the freezing cold or the scorching desert. It could run for hours without jamming. It was not elegance, it was endurance. That reliability became its true weapon, a gun that could fire forever, a weapon that could outlast fear itself. In the years leading to Holzwihr, the American military had taken the principles of mass production, standardization, interchangeability, industrial scale, and applied them to warfare. The result was not just a gun, but a doctrine. While German engineers pursued technical perfection, the Americans built reliability into every bolt and barrel. They didn't need the most complex weapons. They needed weapons that every soldier could trust. The Browning M2 fit perfectly into that philosophy. It could be mounted on jeeps, tanks, bombers, half-tracks, and even ships. It became the universal language of American firepower. By 1945, wherever American forces moved, the M2 moved with them, mounted high, turning slowly, always watching, always ready. In Holzwehr, that doctrine met the German army's last remnants of confidence. The 2nd Mountain Division had seen combat before, on the Eastern Front, in Italy, in the Balkans. Its men were veterans, hardened by years of brutal fighting. Yet nothing had prepared them for a lone American soldier who refused to die, and a weapon that refused to stop. The after-action reports described the engagement clinically. Enemy assault repelled, estimated 50 casualties inflicted by Lieutenant Murphy. But the numbers could not capture the terror of that moment. Witnesses spoke of streams of tracer fire cutting through the fog, of the deafening rhythm of the gun, of tanks halting mid-assault as the .50 caliber rounds tore through their optics and crews. When the Germans finally retreated, the battlefield fell eerily silent, except for the sound of the M2 still cooling, metal ticking softly in the cold. Murphy was later awarded the Medal of Honor for his defense of Holzwehr. The citation described a single soldier holding off an entire company, but the weapon shared his victory. The M2 had once again proved that simplicity, multiplied by industrial will, could crush even the most disciplined army. That day in Holzwehr was more than a battle. It was a turning point in the psychology of modern war. The Germans, who once had prided themselves on their superior small arms, the MG-34, MG-42, and MP-40, were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Technological brilliance was meaningless without logistical abundance. Precision meant nothing against persistence. The flying hammer, as some later called the Browning, became the embodiment of America's new warfare, a blend of machinery, manufacturing, and merciless endurance. As 1945 unfolded, the echoes of Holzwehr spread across Europe. Every German unit that heard the slow, heavy rhythm of the M2 understood what it meant. They were facing an enemy who could keep firing long after the last German bullet had been spent. The sound of the Browning was not just gunfire, it was the sound of inevitability.
September 6, 1943, Stuttgart, Germany. The late summer air above the city shimmered as sirens wailed below. On radar screens and lookout towers, the black dots appeared first as a rumor, then as a certainty. 388 B-17 flying fortresses were approaching from the west, the first major daylight raid on Germany's industrial heartland. Luftwaffe pilots were waiting. They were veterans of countless battles, men who had hunted bombers over the Channel and Moscow and returned with rows of victory tallies painted on their aircraft. They had faith in their machines. The Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109 and their doctrine: attack from above and ahead, fire short bursts, and peel away before the return fire could find them. As they rolled into their dives, cannons began to thunder. Shells streaked toward the oncoming bombers, explosions flashing against the blue. Yet something was wrong. The air itself seemed to explode with light. From every bomber in the formation came not smoke, but flashes, Hundreds of muzzle bursts, synchronized, disciplined, and devastating. Each B-17 carried 13 Browning M2 .5 caliber machine guns, mounted in every direction: nose, tail, waist, dorsal, and belly turrets. In a formation of 36 bombers, that meant 468 heavy machine guns, each firing at 500 rounds per minute. Together, they created a continuous storm of steel, over 6,000 rounds per minute, sweeping the sky clean of anything that dared approach. German pilots had trained to fear explosive cannon shells. They knew that a single 20-millimeter hit could tear a bomber apart. But this was different. The American bullets did not explode, they punched through. The big half-inch rounds tore through wings, fuel tanks, armor plating, and pilot canopies, leaving gaping holes that bled smoke and hydraulic fluid. The Luftwaffe had never seen defensive fire like this. Fighters dived in, only to find themselves flying into walls of tracers. One ace, Oberleutnant Heinrich Vermheller, later wrote to his family, "To attack the Americans is to fly through a storm of steel. You see the tracers, 1 in 5, and you know that for every tracer you see, 4 bullets you cannot see are flying past. By the time you reach cannon range, you are already inside their killing zone." For every bomber that fell, 2 or 3 German fighters went down in flames. The cost was unbearable. Experienced pilots, men the Luftwaffe could no longer replace, were being shredded by gunfire from aircraft that flew like floating fortresses. The German Air Force began to understand that it wasn't just facing a weapon, but a system, a doctrine forged in the factories of Detroit and Buffalo. The mathematics of American firepower had replaced the art of air combat. Each B-17 carried between 5,000 and 7,000 rounds of .5 caliber ammunition, and some crews even packed more, ignoring weight limits. The U.S. doctrine did not rely on a single perfect shot. It relied on an avalanche of bullets. German pilots attempted new tactics. They attacked from the front, diving head-on through the formations. They tried climbing from below, where the bombers' fire arcs were weakest. They tried lateral slashing runs, hoping to catch a single bomber in crossfire. None of it worked for long. The Americans had built overlapping fields of fire into their combat box formations. Every gap was covered by another gunner. If a fighter approached from below, the belly turret would track it. From above, the dorsal guns. From behind, the twin tail guns. From the sides, the waist positions. The result was an impenetrable three-dimensional grid of death. The key to the American success was not sophistication, it was reliability. German aircraft cannons like the MG-115 and Mk-108 were powerful but temperamental. They jammed in the cold, overheated under stress, and required constant maintenance. At high altitude and sub-zero temperatures, the lubricants would freeze solid. The Browning M2, by contrast, fired in any condition. It operated in snow, ice, and tropical heat alike. Crews often fired it until the barrels glowed red, swapped the overheated metal for a new one in minutes, and kept shooting. The gun's mechanism, designed by John Browning decades earlier, was simple, solid, and nearly indestructible. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer, a Luftwaffe pilot who survived the war, later told Allied debriefers in March 1946, "We called the American bombers the Fliegenden Festungen, the flying fortresses. But what made them true fortresses was not the armor or their discipline. It was those machine guns. They never jammed. They never gave us an opening. We lost more men to the bombers' guns than to American fighters. Flying into that formation was like flying into a meat grinder." By late 1943, German morale in the air had begun to break. The Luftwaffe still fought ferociously, but its aces were dying faster than new pilots could be trained. The long-range escort fighters that would soon arrive, the P-51 Mustangs, only sealed the fate that the Browning had already written in the sky. Behind each 50 caliber burst was not just a bullet, but an idea. That war could be won by volume. That overwhelming, relentless, unstoppable fire would wear down even the most disciplined enemy. The weapon became the American answer to the Luftwaffe's doctrine of precision. Where the Germans prized skill, the Americans relied on power. Where the Germans valued maneuver, the Americans valued mass. It was the difference between craftsmanship and industry, between finesse and force. As the wreckage of the day's raid fell burning across Stuttgart, one truth became inescapable. The air war had changed. The era of the dueling ace was ending. The future belonged to machines, reliable, mass-produced, and utterly merciless. From that day on, the Luftwaffe never again viewed the B-17 with contempt. They attacked because they had to, not because they believed they could win. Every burst of tracer fire, every glint of sunlight off a Browning barrel was a reminder that the Americans had turned industrial production into a weapon of its own. The sound of the M2's heavy rhythm echoed in every German pilot's mind, a thunderclap that signaled the death of the old air war.
June 6, 1944. Normandy, France. The sea was gray and angry that morning. The beaches of northern France erupted under the relentless pounding of naval guns, and through the smoke came the silhouettes of landing craft filled with American soldiers. On the bluffs above, German troops of the 21st Panzer Division waited behind sandbags and machine gun nests. Among them was Oberst Hans von Luck, a seasoned officer who had fought in North Africa and Russia. He expected courage from the Americans, but what he encountered was something entirely different: a machine storm. When the first American tanks crawled onto the beach, von Luck's men opened fire. But within minutes, their own positions were shredded. Every tank, every half-track, every jeep that emerged from the surf spat fire from a weapon mounted high and turning with mechanical precision. The .5 caliber Browning was everywhere, on Sherman tanks, M10 tank destroyers, armored cars, jeeps, trucks, and even supply convoys. It had become the most ubiquitous instrument of war on the battlefield. Von Luck wrote later in his memoir, Panzer Commander, "We had been told that German training and tactics would overcome American material advantage. But in Normandy, I learned the truth. The Americans did not need superior tactics. They had enough ammunition to make mistakes and still win." It was not a metaphor. American units advanced through hedgerows, firing continuously. Every hedge, barn, and window that could conceal a threat was riddled with bullets before infantry ever approached. The U.S. Army called it reconnaissance by fire. To the Germans, it felt like madness. To the Americans, it was doctrine. A single armored division could field hundreds of .5 caliber machine guns, each supplied with thousands of rounds of ammunition. The result was a form of warfare the Germans had never imagined, a continuous roar of fire, an unending rhythm of death that drowned out all tactics. The MG-42, the pride of the Wehrmacht, could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, twice the rate of the Browning. It was accurate, terrifying, and mechanically elegant. Yet its greatest flaw was one the Americans had already solved: logistics. German units often carried no more than 1,800 rounds per gun. Their doctrine demanded strict fire discipline. The Americans, by contrast, fired freely, their supply lines delivering endless belts of ammunition. Where German squads fought to conserve bullets, American units fought to overwhelm. In the bocage country of Normandy, where visibility was limited and ambushes were frequent, The sheer volume of American fire destroyed German initiative. Soldiers soon refused to move in daylight. One captured squad leader told his interrogators, "It was mathematics. Movement meant death." The American armored columns perfected a technique that turned firepower into geometry. Convoys advanced in alternating formation, one vehicle firing to the right, the next to the left, creating a crisscross of suppressive fire that covered both flanks. Any hint of movement in the hedgerows triggered a storm of bullets. The Germans called it die Feuerhölle, the fire hell. Entire ambush teams were annihilated before they could even shoulder their Panzerfausts. German anti-tank gunners began to dread the sound of approaching engines, for they knew what followed: the rhythmic beat of dozens of Brownings opening fire at once, their tracers sweeping across the countryside like the scythe of an invisible reaper. Reports from captured units tell a consistent story. German platoons that had once excelled in stealth and maneuver now cowered in silence. Convoy ambush tactics that had worked in Russia and North Africa failed catastrophically in France. The U.S. Army had created a battlefield where movement itself became impossible. The enemy could not advance, could not retreat, could not resupply. The .50 caliber gun was not just a weapon, it was a barrier. One of the most feared American vehicles was the M16 multiple gun motor carriage, a half-track fitted with 4.5 caliber Brownings in a powered turret. Originally designed for anti-aircraft defense, it proved devastating against ground targets. The troops nicknamed it the meat chopper or the kraut mower. An after-action report from the 473rd Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion in November 1944 described how these vehicles repelled repeated infantry attacks by sweeping fire across open fields. Each turret produced 2,200 rounds per minute, a wave of destruction that no human formation could endure. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had virtually been destroyed, and the anti-aircraft half-tracks turned their guns downward. Wherever they appeared, German infantry melted away. As the Allies pushed east through France, supply became the true weapon of war. American convoys stretched for miles, carrying ammunition, fuel, and food across the ruined countryside. German commanders, desperate to halt the advance, ordered ambushes along narrow roads and wooded passes. But the pattern repeated itself. Every few trucks carried mounted Brownings, their gunners scanning the horizon. When the ambushes began, the return fire was immediate and overwhelming. German platoons were torn apart within seconds. Survivors fled into the woods, leaving behind smoldering weapons and blood-soaked ditches. By autumn, the Wehrmacht had all but abandoned large-scale attacks on American supply lines. Their losses were too heavy, their morale too fragile. The unstoppable rhythm of .5 caliber fire had broken them. The cumulative effect went far beyond the battlefield. American logistics became unstoppable because the Germans could no longer interfere with it. Every gallon of fuel, every crate of shells, every replacement rifle reached the front lines on time. The Wehrmacht, meanwhile, starved. Ammunition rationing became routine. Tanks sat idle for lack of gasoline. Units reported receiving orders without the means to execute them. The imbalance was total. It was as if the Americans had built an empire of bullets, and at its heart stood the M2 Browning, simple, relentless, unbreakable. In the quiet moments between battles, captured German soldiers began to reflect on what they had seen. Many had fought on the Eastern Front, facing human waves and artillery barrages. Yet, they said, nothing compared to the Americans. One prisoner told his interrogator, "The Russians attacked with people. The Americans attacked with fire." This was not mere poetry. It was the most accurate description of American doctrine. Fire first, move later.
Machine guns were used not to support infantry, but to lead the attack. The fire gun never stopped. It shaped the landscape itself, flattening hedgerows, tearing through stone walls, reducing entire hamlets to rubble. Even the nights offered no peace. American gunners fired bursts of tracers into the darkness, their glowing arcs marking invisible boundaries that no German dared cross. Every fifth round burned red, and between those lines of light flew 4 invisible bullets. Watching them, German soldiers realized a horrifying truth. What they could see was only a fraction of what was killing them. By the winter of 1944, the psychological effect was complete. Veteran officers wrote of men who could no longer stand up under the weight of American firepower. They trembled at the first distant rumble of a tank column, certain that behind it came hundreds of Brownings ready to turn any open field into a graveyard. Even when no shots were fired, the threat of the weapon shaped their behavior. Soldiers refused to move in daylight. Patrols disobeyed orders to cross open ground. Convoys halted for hours waiting for nightfall. The presence of the .5 caliber had become a psychological front line, stretching across Europe. The German army, once famed for its precision and discipline, found itself paralyzed, not by fear of defeat, but by the impossibility of victory. And behind every burst of fire, every scorched field, every shattered wall, lay the same truth that had been revealed at Holzweier. The United States had not built the perfect weapon. It had built the reliable one. It was not brilliance that turned the tide of war. It was repetition. Endless, mechanical, dependable repetition. The same sound that haunted the skies over Stuttgart now ruled the fields of France. The heavy, measured rhythm of the M2 Browning, the heartbeat of an army that could not be stopped.
By late 1944, the war in Western Europe had become a single, continuous battlefield stretching from the beaches of Normandy to the Rhine. German troops lived under a sky that never seemed empty. It was filled with the low, guttural roar of radial engines, a sound that made every soldier freeze, every driver stop, every officer scan the horizon. It was the sound of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the heaviest and most durable fighter-bomber of the American arsenal. The Germans called it Der Donnerbolzen, the Thunderbolt, and they learned to fear it not for its bombs, but for the devastating 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns embedded in its wings. Each gun fired 425 rounds. Together, they unleashed 4,400 bullets per minute. For the soldiers below, that meant a single P-47 could turn the ground into a furnace of lead. When the Americans first introduced the Thunderbolt in Europe, Luftwaffe commanders dismissed it as clumsy, too big, too heavy, too slow to fight their sleek Messerschmitts. But in ground attack operations, its mass became its strength. The P-47 could dive at nearly 700 kilometers per hour, soak up anti-aircraft fire, and pull out of its run with barely a scar. It was, as one pilot said, a flying tank with wings. What made the P-47 truly terrifying was not its bombs, but its machine guns. Strafing runs became the daily punctuation of German life behind the front lines. Convoys, trains, and troop columns that once moved with discipline now scattered like insects the moment they heard engines in the distance. A typical attack came without warning. The first sign was the faint whine of engines above the clouds. Then from the sun or a bank of mist, the silver-bellied fighters appeared, dropping fast, wings level. At 800 meters, the pilots opened fire, and the air filled with streaks of red tracers. The bullets hit roads, trees, vehicles, and men alike. Metal ripped, fuel ignited, and the neat geometry of German order turned into chaos. A German supply sergeant later told interrogators, "You hear the engines first, By the time you look up, they are already firing. The bullets hit the road, the vehicles, the men, all at once. There is no cover that works. Stone walls crumble, trees are cut down, metal tears like paper. For soldiers, the instinct to seek shelter became meaningless. Hiding behind a wall or under a truck offered no safety. The .50 caliber bullets could pierce both, sometimes passing through multiple obstacles before stopping. Men who survived the first pass rarely survived the second. Each P-47 carried roughly 3,400 rounds of ammunition, enough for several attacks in a single sortie. American pilots called their missions armed reconnaissance. They would simply fly over designated sectors, searching for targets of opportunity, convoys, gun emplacements, or lone vehicles on country roads. To the Germans, this was a new kind of warfare, relentless, impersonal, and efficient. The P-47 pilots didn't hunt individual enemies. They erased anything that moved. Every daylight journey became a gamble with death. Commanders began to issue new orders. All movements were to occur at night or under heavy cloud cover. But even darkness was no guarantee. American ground forces had already adopted the same philosophy: fire at everything suspicious. Between the endless bursts of the M2 on land and the strafing P-47s from above, the front lines of the Reich had dissolved into a zone of perpetual fire. The numbers told the same story. During the summer and autumn of 1944, Thunderbolt squadrons destroyed thousands of trucks, locomotives, and armored vehicles. The German army's logistics chain collapsed, not from lack of courage, but from air-delivered machine gun fire. Unlike the British or Soviet air forces, which emphasized bombing and artillery coordination, the Americans relied on the simple arithmetic of destruction. The more bullets fired, the fewer enemies left. Each flight of 4 P-47s brought 32 machine guns to bear. A single attack wave could sweep a highway clean of life. Survivors often described the attacks as horizontal rain, a storm of lead so thick that the very air seemed to hiss. One German corporal captured near Liège described the terror in his interrogation notes. "At night we feared their tanks. By day we feared the planes. You could see the fire before you heard it. The ground exploded all around. Even when they missed, the noise shattered your mind. You wanted to run, but there was nowhere to run." The P-47's psychological impact was immense. Troops began abandoning vehicles at the first hint of air activity, preferring to walk through forests and ditches rather than risk the open roads. The speed of American advances increased not only because of superior logistics, but because the enemy simply refused to move in daylight. Every time a P-47's engine echoed overhead, entire sectors froze. German officers struggled to maintain command and control. Telephones were cut, radio convoys destroyed, and supplies burned before reaching the front. The Wehrmacht's finely tuned war machine was unraveling, not from a single catastrophic defeat, but from the relentless attrition of firepower. When General-Major Fritz Bayerlein of Panzer Lehr Division analyzed his unit's collapse after Operation Cobra, the Allied breakthrough from Normandy, he noted that it was not the bombs or the tanks that had destroyed his division. It was the constant machine gun fire that prevented his men from maneuvering. He wrote, "Our soldiers could not move. Any movement drew immediate fire. Their machine guns were everywhere, on tanks, on jeeps, in the air. They fired until there was nothing left to shoot." By early 1945, the once mighty Luftwaffe could no longer protect its troops. The skies belonged entirely to the Americans. German commanders who had fought for years on multiple fronts began to understand a grim reality. They were not being defeated in individual battles. They were being outproduced. For every German gun, there were 10 American guns. For every truck destroyed, another arrived within hours. For every aircraft lost, 2 new ones appeared over the front. The .50 Browning had become the common thread that united American firepower. mounted on tanks, ships, planes, and even in foxholes. It was the sound of industrial supremacy made flesh. The final irony was that the Germans themselves respected the weapon's simplicity. Post-war reports by surviving officers called it the most practical and universal machine gun of the war. It had no elegance, no romance, but it had what mattered most. It worked. To the soldiers on the ground, that meant a lifetime of fear compressed into seconds. The scream of engines, the flash of tracers, and the tearing thunder of a weapon that never missed its chance. By the spring of 1945, when the P-47s roamed freely over a shattered Germany, every man who heard that sound knew the truth. The war was no longer about courage or tactics. It was about who could keep firing longest. And America, armed with the Browning, could fire forever.
December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest. Snow fell silently over the pines, covering the wreckage of months of war. Beneath that calm, 200,000 German soldiers waited in the cold. Their orders were desperate yet ambitious. Break through the Allied lines, reach the Meuse River, and divide the enemy armies. It would be Hitler's last gamble, his final bid to change the course of the war. For the first few days, it seemed to work. The German offensive, soon to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, achieved total surprise. Fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft. American units, stretched thin, fell back in confusion. Columns of German armor rumbled through the narrow forest roads, and for a brief moment it seemed as if the old lightning of Blitzkrieg had returned. But the illusion could not last. The same logistical and material advantages that had crushed the Wehrmacht in Normandy began to reassert themselves. When the skies cleared, the .50 caliber Browning once again became the voice of inevitability. At the besieged town of Bastogne, surrounded American forces clung to their defenses. Temperatures dropped below freezing, ammunition was rationed, and food grew scarce. Yet through the snow and chaos, one constant remained: the rhythmic, pounding fire of the M2 machine gun. Mounted on tanks, dug into foxholes, and fixed atop makeshift barricades, the .50 caliber transformed Bastogne into a fortress of steel. German infantry, who attempted to infiltrate the lines at night, found themselves illuminated by tracers, caught in the overlapping arcs of fire. Their grenades froze in their hands, their courage froze in their chests. The Americans held. When General McAuliffe sent his legendary one-word reply to the German demand for surrender, it was not bravado. It was confidence in firepower. As the weather cleared, the sky filled once again with the roar of engines. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs swept across the battlefield, their 8 Browning machine guns cutting through the forest like invisible saws. German convoys that had moved freely in the fog were now trapped, destroyed from above by the same weapon that haunted them on the ground. The Browning's thunder echoed through the Ardennes for weeks. German columns disintegrated under continuous attack. Tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel. Soldiers fled into the woods, leaving behind their weapons. Those who survived later described the nightmare in stark detail. "We could not move," recalled one Panzer Grenadier. "Even when we lay still, they fired. You could hear the bullets cutting through the trees. It was like the forest itself was turning against us." The German plan had relied on surprise, weather, and speed. By late December, all three were gone. American logistics surged back to life. Supply trucks poured through the snow-covered roads, each one bristling with .50 calibers. Convoys that once carried ammunition now carried confidence. The Germans had miscalculated profoundly. They assumed that bad weather would neutralize American air power and limit their heavy fire advantage. They had not realized that the .50 caliber machine gun needed no clear sky. It required only a line of sight.
Even in fog and blizzards, the Brownings continued to fire, mounted on jeeps, half-tracks, and tanks. They were immune to weather, terrain, and exhaustion. The same gun that had torn through Normandy's hedgerows now tore through the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Among the German commanders tasked with holding the line was General Oberst Alfred Schlemm, head of the 1st Parachute Army. A career soldier, he had fought across Europe since 1939 and now faced the impossible, defending Germany's western border with dwindling fuel, ammunition, and men. In his post-war analysis, written in Allied captivity, Schlemm reflected on what truly broke his army. It was not the tanks or the artillery that defeated us, but the endless small arms fire. The Americans could bring machine gun fire to any point at any time. Our soldiers learned to recognize the sound at great distances. They called it the sound of hopelessness. By early 1945, the term hopelessness had replaced defeat in many German field reports. Units were still fighting, but their actions had lost meaning. The war was no longer about holding ground, it was about surviving another day under relentless fire. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the pattern repeated. German positions collapsed not because of a single decisive battle, but because of the cumulative weight of American firepower. Every attempt to maneuver was met with instant reaction. Every concentration of troops drew devastating .50 caliber fire from tanks and trucks. In urban battles across the Rhineland, the Browning became the door-knocker of history. Its massive bullets punched through stone walls, shattered windows, and tore through upper floors where German snipers hid. Tank commanders used their turret-mounted guns to clear entire buildings before advancing. For German infantry, even the idea of cover had become a cruel joke. Walls that once offered protection now became death traps. We took shelter behind a thick wall, and the bullets came through it as if it were made of paper. There was nowhere to hide. You were alive only until they chose to fire again. The psychological toll reached its breaking point. Commanders reported soldiers abandoning positions without orders, fleeing at the first sight of American vehicles. Not from cowardice, but from a cold, logical understanding, nothing could stop the fire. Even in cities, where every street was fortified and every house turned into a bunker, the pattern repeated. The Americans advanced behind a constant wall of fire, each street corner cleared by the same rhythmic, methodical bursts of .50 caliber rounds. German anti-tank teams, once so effective in ambush, could barely operate. To aim a Panzerfaust meant exposing one's body for a few seconds, and in those seconds, the air filled with tracers. The courage to fight had become suicide. By the time the snows melted, the German army was a ghost. The last offensives had consumed their fuel, ammunition, and hope. What remained of the Wehrmacht fought on instinct, knowing that every engagement would end the same way, drowned in fire. Historians later called the Battle of the Bulge the last gasp of the Nazi war machine. But for those who lived through it, it was more than that. It was the final proof that modern war belonged to the side that could keep shooting. The Browning M2 was not the reason the Allies won the war, but it was the weapon that made victory inevitable. Its roar was heard from the frozen woods of Bastogne to the bridges of the Rhine. It echoed across every battlefield of the Western Front, a sound as steady and certain as the ticking of a clock marking Germany's final hours. When the war finally ended in May 1945, survivors spoke of many things: courage, defeat, loss. But again and again they returned to that sound, the sound of the heavy machine gun that never jammed, never tired, and never stopped. In the words of one German officer, written years later in a quiet memoir, "The Russians defeated us with numbers, the British with patience, the Americans with fire."
May 1945. Germany was silent. The fires had burned out, the engines had stopped,
And in the shattered cities, only the echo of the past remained. The war in Europe was over. Yet one sound, that heavy, deliberate rhythm of the .50 caliber Browning, lingered in the memories of millions. It had become more than the weapon of a single army. It was the heartbeat of an empire of industry. The German officers who survived captivity would spend years trying to understand what had gone wrong. Their armies had been disciplined, their weapons technologically superior, their soldiers experienced and brave. The Americans, they admitted, had not always shown the same finesse or tactical artistry. But the Americans had something else, a system that could produce and sustain firepower on a scale the world had never seen. At the center of that system stood the Browning M2. Its specifications were deceptively ordinary, weighing roughly 84 pounds without its tripod, firing 450 to 575 rounds per minute, and using a cartridge half an inch in diameter. The weapon was not particularly fast, light, or revolutionary. Yet it did not need to be. What made the M2 exceptional was not innovation, but consistency, the ability to fire under any condition, with minimal maintenance, anywhere in the world. It could operate at 40 degrees below zero or 40 degrees above. It could keep firing even when its barrel glowed red, when its mount was bent, when its crew was dead. It was the most forgiving weapon of the war, tolerant of abuse, dirt, rain, sand, and fear. Other nations had weapons that were more sophisticated. Germany's MG-42 had a higher rate of fire. The MG-131 aircraft gun was lighter and faster, and the 20mm cannons of the Luftwaffe delivered more explosive power. But those guns required care, precision, and craftsmanship. The M2 required only a belt of ammunition and someone willing to pull the trigger. By 1945, the United States had manufactured nearly 2 million .50 caliber machine guns of all variants, with over 350,000 of the heavy barrel model alone. Factories that had once built refrigerators, car parts, and spark plugs were now producing death in perfect rhythm. Each gun came off the line identical to the last, its parts interchangeable across divisions, theaters, and decades. It was industrial warfare distilled to a single form. The idea that a weapon need not be perfect if it could be everywhere. This philosophy extended far beyond the battlefield. In the same way the M2 could be mounted on tanks, planes, ships, and trucks, American logistics functioned as a unified organism. Bullets manufactured in Illinois could reach Normandy in days, be fired in the Ardennes weeks later, and replaced by the ton before the barrels cooled. No other nation could match that tempo. German factories bombed by B-17s could not keep up. Fuel shortages crippled supply. Even the most brilliant engineering became meaningless when there were not enough parts or men to sustain it. The Browning .50 caliber was not just a gun, it was a proof of concept, that in an industrial war, the side that masters mass production and reliability will always defeat the side that chases perfection. In the years that followed, historians would struggle to categorize it. Was it a machine gun, an anti-aircraft gun, an anti-vehicle weapon? The truth was that it had been all of them. It defended bombers over Stuttgart, shredded tanks in Normandy, guarded convoys in the Ardennes, and strafed columns retreating through the Rhineland. Its legacy extended beyond World War II. The same weapon, unchanged in design, would serve in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and even into the 21st century. 80 decades after its introduction, the Browning M2 remained in service with armies around the world, its sound instantly recognizable, a slow, steady thunder. Few weapons in human history have lasted so long without alteration. It outlived the MG-42, the Spitfire, even the B-17 itself. Its continued use is a quiet monument to the industrial genius that built it, and to the philosophy that powered the American war machine, that quantity, reliability, and endurance are the true weapons of victory.
For the Germans who faced it, the memory never faded. In post-war interrogations, officers spoke not of defeat by superior tactics, but of the exhaustion of fighting an opponent who could replace everything, guns, planes, men, and ammunition, faster than they could destroy them. The .50 caliber had become the symbol of that imbalance. Each tracer that burned across the sky was a line drawn by industry. Each burst a signature of mass production. It was not a weapon designed for heroism or beauty. It was designed to make heroism obsolete. In the Grand Museums of War, the M2 is often displayed quietly, mounted on a jeep or tank, polished and inert. Visitors pass by it without understanding that this simple, rugged machine once reshaped the very logic of combat. It represented the moment when craftsmanship surrendered to mass production, when the individual soldier gave way to the system, and when industrial might became the decisive factor in human conflict. For the men who built it, it was just another contract, another line on a production schedule. For those who faced it, it was the face of modern war itself, cold, mechanical, endless. When the last German officers filed their surrender reports in 1945, many concluded with the same haunting sentiment. One of them wrote, "We were defeated not by men, but by a machine. It was everywhere, on land, in the air, on the sea. It never tired, it never missed, it never stopped." The Browning M2 did not end the war alone, but it defined the way wars would be fought thereafter, not as duels of soldiers, but as contests of production.